Joe Keery's story does not begin with flashing lights, red carpets, or overnight fame, but with a quiet kind of ambition that grows slowly, the kind that survives rejection, doubt, and long stretches of being unseen. And this is what makes his journey so deeply inspiring. Because before the world knew him as Steve Harrington, before fans across continents recognized his face or his music, he was simply a young man from Newburyport, Massachusetts, carrying a creative restlessness that refused to let him live an ordinary, unexamined life. And from the very beginning, Joe Keery embodied the idea that success is not about noise, but about consistency. Not about luck, but about showing up again and again when nothing seems to be working. Growing up in a modest, supportive household as the second of 5 children, Joe learned early how to observe, how to listen, how to find his own space in a crowded room. And those skills would later translate into performances that felt natural, human, and unexpectedly powerful. Because even as a child, he wasn't chasing attention. He was chasing expression, experimenting with acting in school plays, commercials, and community theater, slowly discovering that storytelling was not just something he enjoyed, but something he needed, something that felt like home in a world that often rewards conformity over creativity. As he moved into his teenage years, Joe Keery did not follow the loud path of instant stardom, but instead took the quieter, harder road of learning his craft, studying theater at DePaul University's theater school in Chicago, where discipline mattered more than dreams and where talent alone was never enough. And it was here that Joe encountered the reality that many aspiring actors face, a reality filled with auditions that go nowhere, callbacks that never come, and moments where self-doubt creeps in quietly and asks if this dream is worth the sacrifice. And what makes Joe's story remarkable is not that he avoided these moments, but that he endured them, working on student films, indie projects, commercials, and background roles, slowly building a foundation that no one outside the industry could see, but that would later support everything he became. Because while the world tends to celebrate the moment success arrives, it rarely acknowledges the years of invisibility that make that moment possible. Before Stranger Things changed his life, Joe Keery auditioned relentlessly, often facing rejection without explanation, learning the emotional endurance required to keep believing when evidence suggests otherwise. And during this time, he wasn't just acting. He was also creating music, forming bands, writing songs, experimenting with sound under the name Joe, a creative outlet that allowed him to express parts of himself that acting alone could not. And this dual identity as both actor and musician reveals something essential about Joe Keery's mindset, that he was never placing all his worth in a single outcome, never defining himself by one role or one industry, but instead building a life rooted in creative freedom, which is often the difference between artists who burn out and those who evolve. When Joe Keery was cast in Stranger Things, it was not initially as the character that would make him famous, because Steve Harrington was originally written as a stereotypical antagonist, a temporary presence meant to fade. But Joe's performance transformed the character entirely, injecting vulnerability, humor, and unexpected warmth into someone who was supposed to be forgettable. And this is where Joe Keery's true power emerged, not by demanding attention, but by earning it, not by overpowering scenes, but by elevating them, and the audience responded instantly. Because there is something universally compelling about watching a person grow in real time, watching a character evolve from arrogance to humility, from selfishness to care, and in many ways, Steve Harrington's journey mirrored Joe Keery's own, a reminder that depth and kindness often come from experience rather than perfection. As Stranger Things exploded into a global phenomenon, Joe Keery found himself navigating sudden fame, an experience that can easily distort identity and expectations. But instead of chasing celebrity, he remained grounded, consistently choosing roles that challenged him rather than confined him. Appearing in films like Molly's Game, Free Guy, and Spree, each performance revealing a different shade of his ability, from charm to menace to quiet introspection. And this deliberate selection speaks volumes about his long-term vision, because Joe Keery never seemed interested in being everywhere at once, but rather in being meaningful wherever he appeared, understanding that longevity in entertainment is built not on visibility alone, but on trust. The trust of audiences who believe in your authenticity and the trust of collaborators who value your commitment. What makes Joe Keery especially inspiring is his resistance to being boxed in, because even as millions recognized him primarily as Steve Harrington, he continued developing his music career, releasing albums that were introspective, experimental, and deeply personal, refusing to treat music as a side hobby or novelty, and instead approaching it with the same seriousness and vulnerability he brought to acting. And this willingness to explore multiple creative identities is not a distraction, but a strength, a reminder that humans are not meant to be singular. That fulfillment often comes from allowing ourselves to expand rather than narrow. And in a culture obsessed with specialization, Joe Keery represents the quiet courage it takes to say, "I am more than one thing." Fame often amplifies flaws, but in Joe Keery's case, it seems to have amplified curiosity, humility, and growth, qualities that are easy to overlook but impossible to fake. Because whether he is speaking in interviews, collaborating with cast members, or performing live, there is a consistent sense that he is still learning, still observing, still becoming, and that mindset is perhaps his greatest asset, because it keeps him open to evolution rather than trapped by past success. And it is this openness that allows his performances to feel alive rather than rehearsed, genuine rather than calculated. Joe Keery's journey also highlights an important truth about modern success, that visibility does not equal value and that viral fame without foundation often fades, while quiet preparation can lead to lasting impact. And his rise reminds aspiring creatives that timing is unpredictable, that progress is rarely linear, and that rejection is not a verdict but a phase, something to move through rather than be defined by. And for those watching his story from the outside, it becomes clear that what looked like overnight success is often the result of years of persistence, invisible to the public eye. As Joe Keery continues to evolve, both as an actor and musician, his story remains unfinished, not because he has not achieved enough, but because he refuses to stop growing. And that is what makes his journey resonate so deeply, because it speaks to anyone who has ever felt underestimated, unseen, or unsure, reminding them that progress does not always announce itself loudly, that sometimes it builds quietly, patiently, until one day it becomes undeniable. And in a world obsessed with instant results, Joe Keery stands as proof that meaningful success often arrives when preparation meets authenticity, when passion is allowed to mature rather than be rushed, and when a person remains true to themselves even as the world begins to watch. As Joe Keery moved deeper into the world of fame, something subtle but powerful began to define his journey, a quiet refusal to let success dictate his identity. Because while the entertainment industry often rewards repetition and familiarity, Joe chose exploration instead, understanding instinctively that true fulfillment does not come from being endlessly recognized, but from remaining creatively alive. And this decision, though less visible than blockbuster roles or viral moments, was shaped the way audiences and collaborators came to trust him as an artist, rather than simply consume him as a celebrity. The sudden attention that followed Stranger Things could have easily pushed him toward safer, predictable choices, yet Joe Keery seemed more interested in discovering what else he could become, embracing projects that challenged tone, genre, and audience expectation, which is a risk many avoid once fame offers comfort. But for Joe, comfort was never the goal. Growth was. Inside the machinery of global recognition, Joe Keery learned quickly that fame magnifies not only success, but vulnerability, because every performance, every public appearance, every creative decision is dissected, praised, or dismissed. And navigating this pressure requires emotional intelligence as much as talent, something Joe appeared to possess naturally, not through detachment, but through awareness, because he did not chase controversy or cultivate an exaggerated persona, instead choosing to let his work speak while his private life remained largely protected, a balance that allowed him to stay mentally present in his craft, rather than consumed by the noise surrounding it. This restraint, often mistaken for shyness or mystery, was actually a form of strength, an understanding that longevity is built on boundaries, and that constant exposure without purpose erodes both creativity and self. As an actor, Joe Keery demonstrated a remarkable ability to transform familiarity into depth, because even when audiences thought they understood him through Steve Harrington, he continued to reveal new emotional layers, showing that charm could coexist with pain, humor with insecurity, and confidence with doubt.